Estoy muy impresionada con la Academia Jurídica. Bueno, la Academia Jurídica chilena siempre es muy impresionante, pero cada vez es mejor.
Está mejorando el nivel, así que bueno. Oh, did we ever meet in Bogota? I think.
Probably I had already left when you. When was? I think we did meet once.
Yeah.
I think we did. I used to be the dean
Yeah,
of Los Andes,
Yeah.
so maybe we met.
like briefly.
Dar este a ver si de pronto funciona. Este está
Ese
funcionando.
funciona, ya.
Okay.
Ahora está funcionando. Yeah. Okay. Well, good afternoon to everyone. So we are going to begin our second plenary panel. So I'm really, really delighted to welcome you all, first of all, as Dean of the Law School. It's a great privilege to welcome you all. And also a great privilege to share this panel with so distinguished professors as Professor Beth Simmons, Professor Helena Alviar, and Professor Armin von Bogdandy. They really do not need any presentation, but I would just like to stress that Professor Simmons is professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Alviar is professor at the Universidad de los Andes from Colombia, and also a visiting professor from Harvard University. And Professor Armin von Bogdandy is a professor at the Goethe University of Frankfurt, and also director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. The topic of our plenary this afternoon is, what a topic, crisis or resurgence of the state. That is something to talk about. I would just like to give some introductory remarks stressing the elements of this topic. First of all, the element of crisis. When we talk about crisis, normally we use it in a vulgar sense, that is a kind of decline or even a catastrophe. But also we could take into account an etymological sense from the ancient Greek krisis, krino, that is choice. So the crisis of the state in our days could be also crisis in the sense of choice. But in our topic, this element of crisis is related and opposed to resurgence in this formula, or resurgence of the state. So this opposition is characterized by this link between the crisis and resurgence, kind of relationship of opposition. However, again, from an etymological point of view, crisis as choice could not be opposed to resurgence. Choice could be linked to resurgence or to decline or even to transformation. Finally, we find this word called state. That is another problem, with several transformations, because we have different kinds of states today, we have different conceptions of state through history. So we can say it's an evolving notion with many complex features, and that have been increasingly complex in our days. So we will start our discussion in this second plenary panel by exploring one of the main components of states, which is territory. Territory, as we know it, is being challenged by several things, by several factors, but mainly, I would say, or more increasingly, by migration. We have the cases of Europe, we have the cases of the United States, and really in every region, including Chile. So, Professor Beth Simmons will present her ideas concerning the crisis and resurgence of the state reasserting territorial sovereignty in the face of globalization. Professor Simmons, please.
So my project that I'm going to talk about today, and the point that I'm going to make, really does deal with the topic directly head on, because we are at a point of perhaps decline, perhaps catastrophe, but certainly of choice with the growth in globalization and the way that that is challenging states of many different kinds to choose policies of integration, to manage their integration with the world economy, to manage the increasing problem of human mobility, and to fashion their ways of creating cooperative arrangements and agreements with other states in so doing. So this is a project that I'm going to present to you some of the work that I've been doing on this theme that is highly empirical in nature. It's empirical, but I'm going to end up with a way to try to think about the choices that states face. So modern states are increasingly experiencing challenges of globalization, from capital flows to trade flows to human mobility, and increasingly the problem seems to be that of human mobility, especially since the last of these has created new kinds of challenges around the world, and in particular are facing challenges as experienced by wealthy states who are politically influential and have an important role in structuring international relations and international law. So we need to seriously think about how states are responding to the challenges of globalization. These issues take on, therefore, a new sort of an urgency. Today I'm going to talk about how states are responding to this crisis of globalization. Many are trying to maintain their very legitimacy by reasserting, sometimes symbolically, trying to reassert control over their territory. So I think there is something of a sort of fundamental collision, if you will, between two of the principles that organize world order. One has to do with the territorial order. It's kind of the way that classical international law has been rooted in a territorial order that stresses territorial jurisdiction, a political logic, national welfare, civil rights, state-granted civil rights. But increasingly, this kind of assumption on which the entire world order has rested largely for at least a century, probably more, is colliding with a new intensified set of rules that in some ways directly contradict this order. We can call this the liberal order, maybe the neoliberal order when we're talking about economic issues, maybe cosmopolitan. But this order is non-spatial. It's based on a market logic. It's about aggregate welfare. And it is often about universal human rights, rights that individuals have by virtue of being human beings, no matter where they rest, no matter where they stand. So there are some important contradictions in these bodies of principles and laws that constitute international order. There's the sort of territorial issues that states draw on when they talk about their national sovereignty, and there are the universal values that we talk about, so almost without thinking hardly when we talk about international human rights. So this is a sort of a logic that we can see clearly reflected in recent discourse. So one thing that I want to show you, first of all, is a dramatic rise in the rhetoric that sees the world as borderless. So some of you might be familiar with Ngrams. This is just a scan of all books that Google has put together, and then there's an interface online where you can access that data and ask the application basically to give you a sense of how dense that word usage is in a body of literature over time. Now, what I'm going to show you is limited to English language literature, but you can do your searches in a range of languages nowadays. But this is millions and millions and millions of books, essentially. So look what we have here over the course of the 1990s. Very interesting that the word borderless is almost becoming is clearly on the sort of a meteoric rise over the course of the 1990s. So it has certainly sort of peaked right around 2005 or so, and it now is on a little bit downward drift. But contrast that with another word, or another set of words, because you can put inverted commas around a phrase and get a phrase. What if we were to look at a word or a phrase that conveys concern about borders? Border security. So we see a really interesting sort of set of something that we can recognize here. For the past decade, talk of the borders world is on the decline, and instead, there's growing concern about border security. So it's interesting that although we constantly are talking about our connective technology, the sense that we're all kind of friends on Facebook now, we're all connected, space is gone, space is shrunk, the idea that somehow the world has been sort of brought together by technology, this is the world we sort of feel like we're operating in a lot of times. But in fact, in much of the world, this is the reality. One-third of the countries in the world have completed or are completing building barriers on their international borders with their neighbors. Of 51 fortified boundaries built between countries since the end of World War II, about half were constructed since the year 2000. And so that gives you a sense of the acceleration going on here. How can we understand this trend? I view it as an effort of the state to reassert its authority in the face of delegitimating global and foreign challenges. Some of them are very real. Some of them are manufactured for other kinds of reasons. And many of these structures are both functional and some are very symbolic. Some of them don't, as we might think, work very well to achieve any kind of actual end. But suffice it to say that not all of the kind of separation structures in the world have a purely functional purpose. They often have a very important political, symbolic meaning as well. We can begin to understand what some of the consequences are of border hardening when we think about the nature of the infrastructure in place. So the research that I've been doing on this with a team of researchers is to try to see if we can document what's happening at the borders, the nature of authoritative state investments at international borders. Now, of course, it's so important to understand law as well, but law without the ability to enforce often is not as strong as you think it might be. And so it's important as a complement to researching law to understand the structures that might be there to assist in its enforcement. And we're taking sort of three different kinds of looks here. At points of entry, these are border crossings, and these are places of tension because on the one hand, these are areas where people want to connect with each other. This is where the road crosses the border, but the border itself is a separating mechanism or a separating institution. So entry points, points of entry, we look at the gates, we look at inspection lanes, we look at official buildings. In other words, the capacity that the state may have to filter. Second, we look at other forms of defense between these border crossings, and we're thinking here of walls and fences and documenting those trends as well. And then finally, we're thinking about law enforcement as well, the capacity to enforce the law. And here is where we use data from OpenStreetMaps, a wiki of where police stations are observed, and they're all geocoded. And we ask, what is the ratio between the density of police stations in a 30-kilometer stretch around the border compared to a state's interior? And that gives a kind of a rough feeling of how much a state, and that's per population, by the way, because obviously you put your police where their population. But that sort of gives a sense, if you will, of the importance that the state is putting on its international borders. So you do a little bit of math, you do a little bit of kind of working with these observations, and it's possible to give a visual presentation of how much emphasis states are putting on guarding their borders. That's what this map here is showing. Now, every circle here is a major border crossing of the world. Border lines are traced based on this algorithm I was describing that estimates how much visible state presence there is at the border, combining the data on the crossings, the walls and fences, which are geocoded and timed, date stamped as well, and the density of police per capita relative to the interior. Clearly, there are some things you can see from this. First of all, wealthy countries build red means that you are likely to be stopped at the border. There's a lot of state presence. And green means that there's practically nothing there. And yellow is sort of, there's something, it's a bit minimal, it's somewhere in between. Think of red as stop, green as go, yellow as caution. You're going to need to probably slow down. There's a likelihood you could be stopped there. So border orientation, you can see from this, is clearly related to some obvious things. Wealth, number one. Rich countries are the ones that are reinforcing primarily their borders, but also wealth differentials. So the more distinction there is between one country and its neighbor, the more likely you are also to see physical structures at the border. Geography matters as well. Not only remoteness, but altitude predicts that there will be relatively little state presence, and the importance of cooperative institutions as well. So you can see Schengen, for example. The Schengen area is all green on the inside. Go, go, go. There's not much there to stop you at the borders that we can see. And the edge of Schengen in particular, the outer edge, the eastern edge, is quite red. So you can see that, that this kind of sort of fits our intuition about what's happening in the world. What if we were to zoom in just a little bit on Latin America, on South America in particular, a region that doesn't have very much in terms of kind of a hard border presence. So you can see all up and down the spine of the Andes, for example, very little that registered very strongly in our measure. You can see up in Arica, though, the very northern top, where Chile touches Peru, that there is more reinforcement up in that, more state presence up in that region. And then we can see some very interesting trends over time as well. So here what we have is we're able to use these satellite images going back in time, and we can look and sort of see the extent to which there's been change over time. And here we're seeing some pretty clear trends. First of all, North America is at the very top of the charts when it comes, this is United States policy, when it comes to state presence at the border. On the bottom, we see Africa. And in between, several countries in between, MENA is the Middle East and Northern Africa. And there we have the continent of South America. Europe looks fairly constant, but if you were to break it apart with Schengen and non-Schengen Europe, it goes like this. Okay, so just sort of to give you a sense. It is possible for institutions to go down through policy decision, but that is not very much what is happening. Why do we care about any of this? Why do we care? Because about 25% of the world's population lives around within a 100-kilometer band of a land border. That's not even including coastlines. About 50% of all civil and interstate violence happens in this 100-kilometer band around borders as well. About 25 million refugees cross in these areas too. Now, much has been, I think this reflects basically the exertion of sovereign authority over international borders, because these are institutions, though, that touch many areas and not just migration. So this is not just picking up migration policy. Trade, security, migration for sure, but it also impacts human rights when these sorts of structures are strongly enforced at the border. In fact, we can almost imagine a visualization, if you will, of how human rights could be impacted by very strong border reinforcements. What can we, let me go back. What can we, I don't know why that, what can we infer from this picture, for example? It is San Diego and the environs on the left-hand side and Tijuana, Mexico on the right-hand side with a fence going down the middle. It would be, I think, really interesting and important to do analysis that also looks at public health impacts, that looks at human rights violations, that looks at all kinds of interesting outcomes because we are driving a wedge between human beings that cannot avail themselves of welfare-improving opportunities on other sides of the border. So there are some real issues at stake here. And in tune with our speakers to follow, there is actually a relationship here as well, a clear correlation with developments with respect to ideology and even to populism. So let's take that sort of indicator that I was doing about the international borders and correlate it with a common measure of populism. And there is a positive correlation here. So the stronger a state, the more emphasis that a state puts on securing its edges, the greater you see an increase in its populist rhetoric. Now, this is not a global sample. This is only 40 countries for which we have data that attempts to measure populism here. And the rhetoric that is picked up here is anti-establishment, anti-elite, and anti-globalization. What to do? How to think about the problem? So we need to think in terms of border governance modalities, because everything I showed you here is on the unilateral end of the spectrum. But what if we were to open our minds up and say, let's think about border governance structures that are, on the one hand, unilateral, maybe more localized, and then maybe more multilateralized. Think of them as being civilianized and militarized, okay? And if we were sort of thinking about organizing our thoughts that way, what kind of border agreements or practices might fall into these spaces? Well, you can see up here, on the one hand, unilateral practices usually had to do with visa regimes, for example, safety inspections. But unilateral practices can surely get far more militarized, weaponized. Harsh policies can be enforced around harsh structures. We can imagine moving to the right and choosing and negotiating policies that are far, far more multilateralized. What are our choices here, and what do they imply? If states take very unilateral actions in this world of interconnectedness, they may not be very effective. And if they move down from the civilianized to the militarized, we might be embracing policies essentially of territorialized securitization, so that almost every policy is viewed through the lens of security problems. But what if we were to go the other way and kind of work our way across from the unilateral to the multilateral? These kinds of policies, as long as they stay civilianized up in this corner and multilateralized, could constitute an order which we might want to describe as a liberal humanitarian international order. Down here in the bottom, these are the kinds of policies in which states cooperatively use their military structures extraterritorially to try to gain border security. And I think those have some questions that we all should be thinking about as well. So let me just conclude by saying that the trend to consolidate traditional territorial control in the state is fundamentally, I think, a response to perceived global challenges. And in so doing, international borders, they're increasingly politically salient spaces of state control with some benefits, but some costs also and risks of making these places where states try to demonstrate and act out their sovereign authority. The best policy solutions, in my view, will not always be to assert an unreflective claim to sovereign borders. Instead, I think it will be important to strike the right balance between effective coordination, humane responses, and depoliticized notions of national security. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Simmons, for this very insightful remarks about a very important subject touching all the world. But now it's the turn to analyze something that is more focalized, but anyway very important. Well, you know perfectly that this is the first time ICONES conference is taking place in Latin America. And the history of Latin American states has been very interesting, generally characterized by instability. The main exception was precisely Chile before the great crisis of 1970 to 1990, and presidentialism, with some short-lived exceptions, as in Brazil, that had a parliamentary system very briefly. And it has been strongly criticized, this presidentialism, by important scholars, as you know, Juan José Lins, among others, but we can find some more optimistic views about this way of conceiving the state in Latin America. So now it's the time for us to listen to the words of Professor Armin von Bogdandy, who will talk about Latin American transformative constitutionalism, a common public law to overcome deep state crisis. Professor von Bogdandy, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation and providing the opportunity to speak here. So, our session is on crisis and resurgence of the state. And my talk now focuses on Latin America, because Latin America holds a lesson for the world in this respect. And that is the title of my talk. It's Latin American Transformative Constitutionalism, which has brought a common public law to overcome deep state crisis. The pictures that you will see now are come from Juan Herrera, who is standing there at the back. He collected them and he's helping me with this. So Latin America has bred an exemplary form of transformative constitutionalism. It is exemplary because it successfully addresses state crises and helps the resurgence of a constitutional state which advances the promises of its constitution. It is also a fine example of public law as envisaged by our society icon S. It's multi-level, it's progressive, it's universalist in outlook, but it is solidly embedded in the local. It's a true political project of change, but it is inclusive and not partisan, so you must just love it. I develop my argument in 3 steps. First, the basic elements of Latin American transformative constitutionalism, then the Latin American common public law as its main outcome, and then how to read its achievements. So the basic elements. Transformative constitutionalism entails the interpretation and application of norms of a constitutional nature in a way that promotes deep social change to attain constitutional aims. In Latin America, transformative constitutionalism is defined by the crises of many states, in particular the challenges of widespread violence, social exclusion, extreme inequality, but also weak domestic institutions due to phenomena such as hyper-presidentialism, a lack of judicial independence, and corruption. Of course, the law, the judges, the courts cannot and should not provide for such change alone. Transformations of that magnitude require a strong commitment of many actors throughout a society and much political will. But this does not diminish the importance of the law. And the judiciary can give a specific contributions to these ends. Such contributions can be observed in many countries. For example, the punishment of state terrorism in Peru, the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the political process of Ecuador, the protection of gay persons in Chile, or the development of a true public health system in Colombia. Now, how is that legally possible? In the 70s and 80s, most Latin American countries were under authoritarian or repressive governments. Only from the 1980s onwards did the countries of the region slowly make the transition to democracy. When they did so, they had clear ideas about what to do. The most important has been the maxim nunca más, That is, never again to military dictatorships. But the countries also looked for broader social consensus. To these ends, they took various steps. Of particular importance is that new constitutions brought rich and often progressive catalogues of rights and have been opened to international human rights. Many also attributed such treaties a special status in their domestic legal orders. Thereby, domestic constitutions overcame an overly rigid understanding of sovereignty and joined a regional system of human rights entrenchment. Transformative constitutionalism, that is, constitutionalism understood as an instrument to face deep state crisis and to trigger profound change toward a state that fulfills the expectations of its citizens, can be found in many countries. The Mexican Constitution of 1917, the Italian one of 1947, or the Portuguese one of 1976 are fine examples. But it is only the Indian Supreme Court, the South African and the Colombian Constitutional Court that seriously took the transformative constitutions to develop a distinct jurisprudence to address structural problems. Indeed, the case law of the Colombian Constitutional Court has played an important role in the development towards the Colombian peace agreement that received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. Transformative constitutionalism is a global phenomenon, but there are two Latin American particularities. First, its transformative constitutionalism is not only supported by a domestic constitution, but also by an international regime that has two operative institutions, the Inter-American Commission and the Court. Second, this two-level system is supplemented with a horizontal dialogue between domestic institutions that share this outlook, judges, but also prosecutors or ombudspersons, and importantly, NGOs. Through these regional discourses, domestic institutions of various countries involved in transformative constitutionalism support each other and thereby strengthen the phenomenon. The international level is crucial for this horizontal entrenchment, since the decisions of the Inter-American Court provide much of the substance that feeds the regional discourse. This dynamic process feeds the legitimacy of the Inter-American Court, whose foundations is a dense network of capillary roots that grow deep into the social tissue of each state in the region. With its bold step of creating the doctrine of conventionality control, the Court did much to energize this development. The term common law is a fitting concept for what is developing, since the conventionality control implies that the convention and the Court's case law must guide the decisions of every judge in the region. Accordingly, every national judge has become an inter-American judge. Now it seems easy to depict such an interpretation of the Inter-American Court as judicial activism, as going beyond its mandate and hence illegal. And yet, few domestic institutions have come to that conclusion, not even the 5 presidents in their letter from April. Why? Because this interpretation did not come about in a one-sided, unilateral, top-down process. Rather, it was a process to which many actors contributed. Indeed, most constitutions attribute to the Convention and its institution a key role in their domestic legal system. They are received in the constitutional foundations of the Convention member states. Doctrinally, this is referred to as the block of constitutionality, formed by the domestic constitution and the Convention. Accordingly, in terms of constitutional theory, this development of the mandate can be explained as an instance of constitutional change. The doctrine of constitutional change shows how deep moral and political shifts in society can impact on the meaning of the law without any formal change. This is particularly so with respect to human rights. Second point, a Latin American common law as the incarnation of the mandate. An essential part of the legitimacy and identity of the inter-American system is the conviction that it contributes to the development of a regional human rights law, encompassing international and domestic law, and that to address the problems of the region. This Latin American common law is not a castle in the sky. Even if it does not amount to a shared understanding of all relevant actors, it does have a real impact in the region. Three features stand out. A first feature of a Latin American common law of human rights is the shared belief that there is such a thing of Latin American law, encompassing the American Convention and domestic legal systems. It's the power of the world. Perhaps its most visible manifestation is that a number of judges, including national judges, consider themselves to be inter-American judges, contributing to the construction of an inter-American jus commune, a common law. A second element of this regional law is that it is fed by decisions of different courts of the system. The relevance is particularly salient in the relationship between the national and the international level. National judicial decisions must, in principle, recognize the authority of the Inter-American Court. At the same time, national decisions define the horizon in which the Inter-American Court operates, as is shown by its many references to domestic decisions. This leads to the third feature of Latin American common law of human rights, the perception of many actors that it allows them to better fulfill their domestic mandates. To foster social change along these lines in the region, cooperation is important. The Latin American common law of human rights serves to jointly face the great challenges of the region. Although no one thinks that courts and the law alone may overcome such challenges, they have an essential role to play. At the same time, this Latin American human rights law does not determine all power relations in the region. To the contrary, it often clashes with conflicting realities and opinions, important forces that hamper compliance. And that brings us to the third point, evaluating the achievements. Perhaps the most common standard for the success of international courts is compliance. In particular, when it comes to social change, it might seem self-evident to focus mainly on whether states comply with the rulings. Now, it is well known that the Inter-American Court fares badly on this standard. However, we need to look far beyond compliance to understand how transformative constitutionalism operates. The Inter-American Court, following its mandates, orders reparation that rather often are extremely difficult to comply with, such as prosecuting individuals which form parts of powerful social groups. If the court looked for full compliance, it would have to give up on its mandate. That does not make sense. In transformative constitutionalism, compliance should give way to wider concerns of impact. If we look at impact, many issues come to the fore. Most striking is the long-term impact. 40 years ago, human rights were dormant clauses, standards few actors in Latin America took seriously. Because of the work of the Inter-American system, human rights have become, in these past 4 decades, operative in many important issues. Today, political discourses and struggles in the region are often framed and developed in a new language, the language of human rights. Being lawyer, we know that form, language, words matter, and that they matter greatly. One might wonder if Latin America today is a better place because of its transformative constitutionalism. The situation continues there for many people, but it seems safe to assume that many people would be worse off without. Indeed, and I'm coming to the end. In the early 1990s, about half of all Colombian citizens were convinced that a true improvement in their personal situation needed a revolution, a true one. In 2016, our colleague Manuel José Cepeda, a leading light of Latin American transformative constitutionalism, was negotiating in La Habana with the FARC for the peace agreement. It was clear by then that many of the FARC members would face criminal justice. So Cepeda did not quite understand why the FARC was sitting there, because it was clear by then also that the FARC could not be defeated. Just remember that even by then they had several thousand men under weapons. What that means, just remember what the so-called Red Army fraction did to Germany with just 10 committed terrorists in the 1970s. So why were they there? Cepeda asked the people from the FARC. The answer, 25 years into the operation of transformative constitutionalism in Latin America, was because we lost the struggle for legitimacy. So, transformative constitutionalism has resurrected the Colombian state as a legitimate one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor von Bogdandy, for this very interesting presentation about Latin America, our constitutionalism, and of this wonderful expression that is the Latin American common law. I really enjoy it personally as an administrative law historian, because it evokes somehow the meaning of tradition for us. In this case, a constitutional tradition that should be linked, nevertheless, with the old or ancient, now defunct constitutions of Latin America that have quite important contents that should be revised and thought about, but also with the old texts coming from the times of the Spanish or the Portuguese. I think in the case of the part of America that was under the Spanish influence, de siete partidas, de recopilaciones de Indias or recopilaciones, la novísima, and other texts that were very important for our development, and in some way they help to define what is to be not just a common law, but also what is to be Latin American. But what it was even more interesting, I would say, is that Professor von Bogdandy closed his intervention with the case of Colombia, and precisely it is the country of Professor Helena Alviar who is going to talk in the third place. We have to take into account that an important part of the current debate about the states in our days is focused in something that is called populism. Different political regimes have been qualified as populists, and very relevantly in our Latin America. So this is an analysis that can be done from different perspectives, but from the viewpoint of public law, a major concern would be the legal architecture of populism. And Professor Helena Alviar is going to share with us some important lines about it.
I'm going to say good afternoon, and I'm going to try to be brief so you can go and watch the eclipse. And I'm going to stay here because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, and it would be very difficult to compete with such beautiful presentations, actually. So my presentation is actually called Legal Architecture of Populism. It's a chapter I wrote for a book that will be appearing at the end of this year, and I thought that the name of the panel, which was The Crisis and Resurgence of the State, was going to be very linked to my thoughts on the legal architecture of populism. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to aim the project within my research. So generally, I've been interested in the last few years in two important, so I've tried to do two things. The first one is to understand the ideological underpinnings of political projects that are sold as being natural or technical or best practices, but that actually have a very deep political, that are committed to a very specific political project. And I'm interested in unveiling that because that distributes resources. So that has been one of the big aims of my work. And then more recently, and I hope that in the following years, this is what I'm going to be researching on, I've been trying to understand the configuration and arguments of the extreme right, and I would argue that the extreme left, both in economic and moral terms in the region, to understand what are the arguments they are using, specifically in terms of law. And so that's my work. And now in terms of this panel, which I find, the phrasing I find very interesting, so the idea of crisis and resurgence. In terms of crisis, I would say that both the left and the right in Latin America invest much energy in describing any current moment as one of crisis, which is something I oppose vehemently, right? So there's this idea that we're in a tremendous crisis. For example, there's always a crisis that is related to we're going to be captured by Castrochavismo, whatever, nobody really knows what that means, but there's that crisis that is right beside us. Or the other crisis, which I think is very prevalent, and I'm going to spend a little bit time on, is the specter of corruption. So, you know, in the region, we feel like either we're going to be captured by something, this specter that is Castrochavismo, or we're going to be dominated by corruption. And so I'm going to give examples about that. And then the solution to that crisis is embodied in one person. So one person is going to save us from corruption, one person is going to save us from Castrochavismo, whatever that means. Now, this crisis leads to a resurgence in the idea of the state. And these many leaders elected as a response to those fears, either the fear of Castrochavismo or the fear of corruption, or a combination of the two, which is also very prevalent. Many of these leaders invoke populist ideas, which later, and this is the fear of populism, have an authoritarian turn. And then the other part of the resurgence is that this authoritarian turn carries with it a strengthening of the state in many ways, and I will try to refer to some of them in this presentation. So in the chapter, I make a parallel between two ideologically opposing figures who actually used each other as the menace. So I summarize the legal architecture deployed by Hugo Chavez and the legal architecture deployed, so Hugo Chavez on the left and Álvaro Uribe, who is a very conservative, important figure in Colombia, who was the president for 8 years. But the people are not as important as the arguments they're using and how they're using the law. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And in terms of the legal arguments they deployed, I concentrate specifically on two things. The first one is both of them tried to use direct democracy consistently to set forth their ideas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And they also tried to legislate, one of them more successfully than the other one, through a special granting of special executive power. So, in order for them to describe the crisis, they had to, the first thing, before even starting to use any of the two legal tools I would like to describe, they had to start out with an idea of the us versus them, which is very important for populist leaders. Now, the idea of corruption is also very important. I think that we in the region should be definitely studying the uses and abuses of the term corruption, how it's being used actually for very authoritarian moves. But I'm going to concentrate in the case of Chavez, the them was the corrupt white elite. He said in 1999, the rotten elites of the parties are boxed in and they will soon be consigned to the trash bin of history. In 8 days, we will make the final assault to remove the corrupt elites from power. So see that he's referring to the elites and he's also referring to corruption in the same way. Now, Uribe in his first mandate said, in his campaign program said, I dream of a state that serves the people, not a state that allows corruption to profit or manipulation of politicians for their personal gain. Today, the state is permissive toward corruption as well as toward political manipulation and stingy with social investment. So see how he's saying that the state is captured, but actually, once he was in power, he also wanted to strengthen that state that he's critiquing in his phrase. Now, specifically in terms of the tools, direct democracy would be the first one. And the two leaders tried with varying degrees of success to change their constitutions through referendums. Both of them started their mandates famously for calls for a referendum and tried to do it at least once during their terms. Chavez, for example, upon inauguration promised a referendum to rewrite the Constitution, and 7 years later sought to reform it once again in order, in his own words, to consolidate the socialist state. The 2006 referendum was very long. It had 69 articles that ranged from had many themes in that. And despite the fact that Chavez announced that whoever voted no was voting in favor of his enemy, George Bush, the referendum was rejected by a very slim margin, so he was defeated there. Now, in the case of Uribe in 2003, one of his first acts in government was a referendum aimed at attacking what he considered bad political practices, or in his own words, politiquería, and corruption. His first referendum had 19 questions that covered a range of topics, from a lifelong ban on the possibility of running for office for citizens found guilty of corruption, again, reducing the size of Congress. Then it included the elimination of mandatory military service and the prohibition to cultivate, produce, distribute, carry, or sell drugs. I mean, it was all-encompassing, this referendum. Most of the articles of this referendum didn't reach the voting percentage needed. So as you see in both cases, direct democracy was a favorite tool, but it didn't really work in either of them. And in 2010, Uribe and his supporters proposed another referendum to amend the Colombian constitution in order to eliminate a prohibition that existed for him to run for a third term. In the words of a leader of Uribe's political party at the time, when they were proposing this referendum, he said, and I open quotes, "No army changes its general at the precise moment they are winning the battle." So this was their way of arguing that they needed a third term. But the voting proposal never took place because the Constitutional Court, which I agree with Professor Bogdandy, has been very important in Colombia. The Constitutional Court struck down the referendum law on procedural grounds. Now, the last example is ruling by executive decree. During his presidency, Chavez obtained 4 enabling laws, one in 1999, one in 2000, one in 2007, and one in 2010. What is interesting about these laws is that they started out as very short periods with very determined topics, and the more powerful Chavez became, the broader they became. So in 2007 and 2008, the themes were all encompassing and the period was extended to 18 months. So you can see how power is being accumulated. And this trend has only increased. Since he took office in 2013, Nicolás Maduro has been granted 53 months to regulate through enabling laws. Now, Uribe tried 4 times with very little success, actually, again, thanks to the Colombian Constitutional Court, to use this special interest. He tried it in 2002, twice in 2008, and once in 2009. So why is the legal architecture important? And I'm going to try to argue why I think it's important. So despite their huge ideological differences and the fact that each one of them used the other to embody their most hated enemy, Hugo Chavez and Álvaro Uribe were very similar leaders in terms of their uses and abuses of law. Both of them had more faith in direct democracy than in a representative one, and they were, they did move or tried to move towards authoritarianism. Now, notwithstanding their similarities, the most striking difference is a strong and independent constitutional court in Colombia, which was able to block Uribe's many attempts to concentrate power. Now, this didn't happen in Venezuela because even though originally the court was much more independent, Chavez was able to change the court. In the end, this presentation proposes that as academics, as citizens, we should be alert to the uses and abuses of direct democracy and granting exceptional legislative powers for the executive as hints towards an authoritarian turn. And so that's my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Alviar, for showing us some examples of the dangers that we can face in our countries, not just in Latin America, but everywhere else. But of course, with this parallel between Venezuela and Colombia, to neighbor countries that are facing important challenges and have been facing important challenges in the past decades. Well, I know that everyone is very concerned about the eclipse, but I would just like to ask one question for each of our participants, because it's such a privilege and a joy to be able to do so, precisely concerning this crisis or resurgence of the state. First of all, I would like to ask a question to Professor Simmons. In your talk, you were remembering how that the way people are separated and the territories are separated as a source of crisis in our days. We know that technological changes have increased the possibility for citizens to interact directly in the construction of political life, may it be for questioning decisions or for proposing solutions. So my question would be, what is, in your opinion, the future of political representation in this context?
Wait, I'm not clear on what the question is exactly. What is the role of technology in enhancing political participation?
Yeah, because when people are communicating through Facebook and having choices and even political choices through technology, they might feel that political representation is not so important as in other eras. So I would like to ask you, what's your opinion about these challenges for representation?
On the contrary, I think people think that political representation is extremely important. And I think a lot of the crisis of legitimacy of the state comes with a dissatisfaction in the way that people have been represented. And I don't see technology overcoming this. In fact, in some ways, I feel like technology is actually contributing, if you will, to the problem, in the sense that a lot of the problem has to do with the unhinging of the political space from other forms of functional space, like the economy, like social connections that seem to transcend boundaries, other kinds of networks, crime organizations. I feel like people think that that the problem is, for them, that their political representation is inherently localized, but the world they're trying to navigate is being pushed around by all kinds of forces that are influencing the quality of their political and social life. I think that's kind of the problem, in my opinion. So that's, to me, where the crisis of legitimacy of the state comes in. I thought, state, that you were going to provide me the good life. I thought that the state could provide me the welfare state system. I thought that the state could provide the cultural context in which I might flourish. Turns out, the state doesn't always control all of those things, in particular, not the economy very well. And so it seems to me like that's sort of what this resurgence is about, is this idea that the political has come unhinged from these external forces that are influencing us in ways that people don't like. Now, we can ask, why is it people are attached to their local? And I've read a lot of that literature on sort of, why is your identity local? Why is it hard to bump up your identity to these levels of these levels of space which are global? It turns out people can't do that very well, you know? They don't think voting in the United Nations is anything like voting in their countries or anything like voting in their communities. So anyway, there's a big psychological literature on just how much can your identity expand beyond a certain distance.
Perfect, thank you so much. Well, next question is for Professor von Bogdandy. You were talking about this transformative constitutionalism, and I would like to make a little counterpoint, because one of the main challenges to current political systems is, I would say, the intensification of individualism. So, taking into account the constitutional patriotism of Habermas as the main factor for cohesion in liberal democratic systems. You can, of course, challenge that premise, but I would like to evoke it. How is it possible to maintain cohesion if even some basic political rules are put into question by an increasing number of citizens?
So thank you for that very important question, because here comes what I see as another contribution of Latin America to the world. It is indeed a recurrent criticism of many people that human rights and civil rights, fundamental rights, lead a society towards ever more individualism, and many people claim that that is inherent in that type of rights. Now, to what I see in Latin America, it's the opposite. In Latin America, these kind of rights are a point where societal groups are formed, and indeed much of the important litigation, it is not just for one specific individual. Either that individual represents a group, or it is entire groups that are protected by these rights. So I think Latin America is the example to claim false those people who say that that type of rights necessarily go with a destructive neoliberal individualism.
Okay, thank you so much. And finally, Professor Helena Alviar. It's a more structural question, I would say. Autonomous or independent agencies have played an important role in the Western world during the last decades. So my question would be very simply, if they are part of the problem or part of the solution in front of this crisis of the state?
But in relationship to populism, or?
If you want, in relationship to populism. If you want, in a general way.
So I don't understand my research like in a form that would say that autonomous agencies are part of the problem or part of the solution. I mean, autonomous agencies are very important. So they've been a very important administrative law transformation in Latin America since the 1990s, and I think that they have, but I see my work as more understanding when one bets everything on a single concept. So a single concept such as autonomous agencies, or with all due respect, transformative constitutionalism. Or because I think that what my proposal is, and I agree that there has been much done by constitutional courts or by courts in Latin America in relationship to human rights, etc. But what I'm trying to understand is what is behind these ideas about autonomous agencies. So yes, autonomous agencies have been very important in some senses, but sometimes they've been also been captured by specific interests, and so they've been set up to give this idea that they're neutral or technical, that they don't have a political agenda, when autonomous agencies, of course, have a political agenda. It depends on who's sitting there, how they're configured, etc. So that is why I started my talk saying a little bit what my research tries to do. And what my research tries to do is to understand that at every turn there are political choices, and that even if you think that something is technical or autonomous or natural, there is politics involved, and that those politics entail specific decisions. And in those decisions, some win and some lose. So that would be my answer to that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, we would like to make a special announcement regarding the solar eclipse that the organization has managed to arrange for ICONES Santiago. We're going to finish this plenary panel, and we're going to head to a sightseeing spot 1.5 blocks away from here. The peak of the eclipse will be at 4:37 p.m., so we're very, very close to it, and it will last about 2 minutes. Please, we would like to be very, very clear that you should not look directly into the sun without the eclipse glasses. So we ask all the people that have managed to buy glasses to share them with others and enjoy this great experience. Afterwards, we will be back to the faculty directly to the panel sessions that start at 16 hours 50 or 4:50. So after the eclipse. So before we head towards this astronomical event, I would like to give a very, very warm round of applause to our participants.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel.
Muchas gracias, Helena.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much.
You are a really good moderator because you engaged everybody so well.
I tried to. I tried to.
You were very well
To make the equilibrium.
Who knows what people are really going to do, right? And you managed to make it all come together. Very, very good.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a very interesting presentation.
So we did that. We're having the human television satellite tell us, how much stake it is.
Il bambino, no, che va verso la montagna.
So white means that there is no major road. But this means there are local roads, no major roads. So that means that there are data. But the yellow means